people who have spent time in a psych ward, what is the craziest thing you've witnessed? I was a social worker at an institution that had a hall for what we called lifers. It was essentially for people who had no hopes of ever being released due to their conditions. Anyway, my hall had 14 beds, and it was full. There was this one guy who was huge. He was 6'7" and about 350 pounds. His name was Simon. He suffered from drug-induced schizophrenia and had bipolar disorder. He talked to himself all day, but never talked to others. All the other men in the ward were scared of him. It was my day to do first shift. I got there early to start on some paperwork I needed to finish. When I got my keys in the door, I heard Simon hit the door with his fists. I looked through the tiny window on the door and he and the hall was covered in blood. I panicked and called security for backup because I thought he had killed somebody. Turns out, Simon was in the throes of an extreme manic episode and had managed to walk the literal soles of his feet off. Other medication he was on thinned his blood and led to him bleeding all over the place. We checked the camera footage and he had walked and talked all night. The orderly, who was fired that day, had slept through his whole shift and never heard Simon walking back and forth. Guy had a tattoo carved into his neck. Apparently, he took a pen in his fist and repeatedly carved it into his skin right on his neck. It looked very scratchy and was still red despite it apparently being pretty old. You know how really young kids grip a crayon in their fist and grind it against the paper really hard? If you make a fist with your left hand and put it below the left ear, that was exactly how he must have done it. A woman I shared a room with demanded to be discharged. It was a voluntary admission, so her doctor discharged her on condition that someone else pick her up and take responsibility for her. Her ex-husband came and signed the discharge paperwork. Then they handed him all of her medications. He proceeded to give her the meds to pack it in her bag and left the room while she was packing. No one else was in the room with her at the time, and she proceeded to drink most of the pills she had. A nurse found her drinking the pills and got the other nurses to help restrain her while they waited for the paramedics. The paramedics loaded her up and took her to the government hospital. I hope she's okay and doing better now. There was a guy who was completely narcissistic and managed to pee off all the other patients by insisting that people who have attempted suicide are weak and should just get on with it. He was also delusional. Insisted that he was the CEO of a big company and better than everyone else. After that, everyone shunned him. Many years ago, I was a student nurse and had one patient that had frequent psychotic episodes with times of lucidity in between. During one of his psychotic episodes, he managed to rip out his IV line, his catheter, and then threw his glass water carafe on the floor. Everything was sopping wet, and there was glass shards all over the floor. I did manage to get him to sit in a chair while I cleaned up the floor and remade his bed with dry bedding. Then I tried to dress him in dry PJs. It was at that moment that a whole platoon of medical students came into the room with their professor to see another patient. This guy then decided I was the sexiest thing alive and tried to kiss me whenever he could while I was trying to dress him. Instead of helping, the medical students just laughed their A's off. Eventually, we had to restrain this guy because he was still in the midst of his psychotic episode. The next day, I had to help the same guy wash up, but this time he was lucid. I'll never forget him apologizing for the previous day. I'll never forget what he said next. "I'm not nuts. I'm a fruitcake, really." And the first thing I thought was, "Dude, you're a nutty fruitcake." I didn't say it out loud, though. A girl grabbed my toe while I was sleeping. I woke up and said, "What the frick?" and she ran off. I went to the front desk to complain, and while I'm talking to the lady, the girl jumped on my back and clung like a monkey while screaming. It was bizarre. I threw her off me, and the lady just said, "Sorry about that." Not super crazy, just odd. Was with a bunch of teens on a pediatric ward, but we all had special rooms by the nurse's desk with shatterproof, wired glass so the nurses could always look in on us easily, and the bathrooms had no locks. Myself and another girl were in for anorexia. Another guy was suicidal to the point where he couldn't have any cutlery but a plastic spoon for meals. No blankets, special pajamas, etc. And then there was a young homeless guy who'd been hit by a car while squeegeeing for change, so his leg was in a full cast. Yet, he still had a habit of sneaking around in his wheelchair and hoarding extra supplies from the kitchen, the kids' playroom, the nurse's station, etc. So they kept him in one of the psych rooms. We formed a weird little club and would often play cards in a lounge area together. Conversations would go something like this. Me: "Hey, does anybody want this cheese? I snuck it into my pocket so nurse thought I ate it." Homeless kid: "Mine. Dibs. Here, you can have these beads I swiped from craft time." Other anorexic: "I'll get you some ice cream and saltines if you find me some sewing gear. I'm gonna sew some batteries into my hair scrunchie for the next weigh-in day." Suicidal kid: "Do you think I'd die if I could scoop my eyeball out with a spoon?" And so on. It was a very bizarro time in my life. The saddest thing ever. They had brought this lady with dementia in for a while. Her husband had just died and she was not doing well. We would be sitting in a group and she would look up and say, "I need to call Bob. He doesn't know where I am." Then they would ask her where Bob was, but she didn't know. And then they would tell her that he had died. She would break down and they would take her back to her room to rest. And this happened like 10 times a day. I had to watch this lady learn that her husband had died over and over again. It was brutal. When I was 19 and admitted the first time, I was anxious already and could barely sleep the first night. My roommate was quiet, which didn't alarm me at first. The next day I went to the common room and talked to some people, and then later went back to my room and found that my roommate had scribbled "Find them" all over the walls and was talking to herself. I was terrified and grabbed a nurse who tried to talk to her, but couldn't make any sense of what she had said, and I asked to stay in another room. I stayed in the restraint room that night by myself and woke up the next morning to a fight in the hallway and nurses running past my room. Apparently, one guy pulled out his D in front of the wrong patient and got punched. Then, later that week, I was cornered by the same guy who pulled out his D and asked if I wanted to have sex in the bathroom. I literally cried after that and was effing terrified, so I would say my whole first trip there. Another story is not as crazy as it is heartbreaking. But in my time working, I've seen my fair share of SI, suicidal ideations patients. But only once have I seen someone who had completely, in every possible sense of the phrase, given up. Unlike anyone else I've come across. He was 60 plus, had spent his whole life homeless and in and out of institutions, living with his brother and his brother's family periodically, until the patient became too much of a burden for the family. I spent every shift with him on a one-on-one, order to have eyes on the patient 24/7, as every chance he could get, he would self-harm with whatever he could find. I'm only a technician, so I don't have a degree of any sort other than a high school diploma. I still would listen to him talk for the hours I spent with him. The most nihilistic and pessimistic tangents I've ever heard. A sense of hopelessness and despair I've never considered possible. Even the mountain of medications he was given seemed to have little effect. And then as his hold ended, he was discharged. I'm not a doctor or certified in any way, as I stated before, but I can't believe he was given the okay to be released. This event sticks with me because I was left without any answers or explanation of what happened. The next day, his room was occupied by a new patient. Not a patient, but an employee. Seen countless patients attacked by other patients, many serious injuries, and a couple that came close to death. Some of the patients' backstories can be wild. Some are almost unbelievably tragic. Some are legit criminal. Some of the most foul and disgusting personal hygiene I've ever witnessed. Worst was a patient who had no concept of using the restroom. They would simply poop or pee themselves wherever they were sitting or standing. It was real fun when they decided to do it during mealtime. I think the most shocking thing, though, is how you can have some truly awful and psychotic patients who turn out to be genuinely cool people once you get them on consistent meds. I'm talking 100% turnarounds. Of course, then they get discharged, stop taking their meds, and the cycle repeats. Saw a 90-pound, 5-foot girl toss one of those 18-liter water cooler bottles, a full one at that, at a bunch of nurses trying to calm her down as she was having a manic episode. It took a few security guards and quite a few nurses to take her down. I'd been just talking to her the previous evening, and she was an absolute sweetheart who gave me a book as a going-away gift as I was being discharged the next day. I still own that book, and I still think about her and wonder from time to time what she's up to. We're briefly in contact, but she dropped off the face of the earth. A close second would be the time for my second stay in another psych unit in 2021. where a guy was going through alcohol withdrawals and screaming about a bear coming into his room, and they had to lock him into his room and keep him heavily sedated. When he was allowed to mingle with people, he was still relatively sedated, so confused and lost, and kept asking me and other people if we knew what happened to that bear. Pretty sure he was an absolute hardcore alcoholic that had fried his brain, and I felt pretty bad for him. Most amazing? For some reason, a piano was in the psych ward. A patient who never spoke started playing. She knew every piece by heart. The entire ward of psychotics, manics, and even staff went and sat in that room. Not a word was spoken for a good half hour. Craziest? Family members choking a patient because his sister gave another patient a BJ. A guy who thought he was Jesus convincing the entire ward to meet on the balcony to discuss ways of breaking out. A guy would run away every day, steal a car, and drive back to the ward. People speaking in tongues. Scary. If you enjoyed, feel free to drop a subscribe. I'm a broke college student and I'd like to be able to afford brand new toothpaste instead of old toothpaste from the garbage. Thank you, have a wonderful night, and as always, drink plenty of water.